Hello, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to SIGA, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahat bin Zaim University. Today, we are joined with a very esteemed guest, along with our friends of the center and students and staff online for a 57th webinar. The title of the webinar is U.S. Empire and the Future of the World Order. At SIGA, we like to explore with our staff and students and keep abreast of international affairs and work and studies in international relations. This webinar is meant to help keep a pace with current events and also with current scholarship on international relations. Today, we are joined by Mr. Raymond McGovern. And we are honored to have him. He comes with a very decorated CV. I won't read all of it, but to highlight a few by way of introduction, Ray came to Washington in the early 60s as an Army infantry intelligence officer, and then served as a CIA analyst for 27 years, from the administration of John F. Kennedy to that of George H.W. Bush. Ray's duties included chairing the national intelligence estimates and preparing the president's daily brief, which he briefed one-on-one to President Ronald Reagan's 5 most senior national security advisors from 1981 to 1985. Later, in January 2003, Ray co-founded Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS, to expose how intelligence has been falsified to justify the war on Iraq. On the afternoon of the day of February 5th, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell misled the UN Security Council on Iraq. VIPS sent a blunt memorandum to President George W. Bush, in which VIPS gave Powell a C-. VIPS ended the memo with harsh criticisms. Ray has not only been an advocate for justice in Washington, D.C., but he has also wrote many opinion pieces that have been featured in the New York Times and the Washington Post. He's a regular, he had regular appearances on the NewsHour, C-SPAN, CNN, BBC, and many other Russian and international news channels. He is also not unfamiliar with academia. He has served as an instructor in many universities, including University of Virginia, in George Washington, and other universities. He has higher degrees in Russian history, language and literature, and minors in theology, philosophy, and classics. I'd like to welcome Raymond McGovern. Thank you. Also joining us is Dr. Sami Al-Arian, who is our director at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. First, I will give him the floor to introduce our speaker and the topic today. Dr. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Awais. And I also want to thank Ray for appearing with us today. I've known Ray now for about, I would say, close to 15 years. He was among the very few who would visit me when I was on house arrest in Virginia. And I particularly remember that day when there was an earthquake. And of course, I couldn't leave, but he said, "You gotta leave, man. You gotta leave." So we went outside, actually. And it was a memorable day. I thank you, Ray, for being with us today. We're really very fortunate to have you. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Ray will speak for about 30 minutes or so. And he would be speaking about the U.S. empire and the future of the world order. Then Awais and I will engage him in discussion. Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sami. It's wonderful to be with you again. I remember visiting you in prison in Southern Virginia as well.
Right.
And I have to say that in this month where we are concentrating on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, and others, that you are also a in-the-flesh embodiment of the principle of nonviolence. I could not understand really how you could smile through all of the travails that our justice system put you through. So thanks for inviting me. I will contribute for what I can to this discussion, bearing in mind that I'm an intelligence officer, an analyst. And there is a dichotomy between analyst and operations officer. Suffice it to say that there are really two CIAs. There always has been. And the one I worked in was the one that Truman established to give him the straight story on what was going on in the world, what he called untreated, unvarnished intelligence, telling him like it was. The operations people did other things. Rest assured that I didn't run any spies. I didn't overthrow any governments. I didn't do any of those other things that actually the CIA is more known for. My job was to evaluate Russian foreign policy and to tell the president what I thought was going on. Now, I never thought that in retirement I would be doing the same job. But there aren't many of us left around who know much about Russia, or at least the Russia I know to be the case. And so I'm going to start out with, actually, why don't I start out with my first portfolio? Now, I came down to Washington when President John F. Kennedy asked us to come down if we had something to contribute to the government, as opposed to asking the government to keep contributing to us. I was with a bunch of people who really thought that that was a neat way to do things and not corny. Now it's a little corny because everybody seems to be in it for themselves. Mm-hmm. Suffice it to say that when I joined the CIA, Kennedy was the president. My first portfolio, which I took over in January of 1964, was Sino-Soviet relations. I mention that because this has an awful lot to do with the changes in the world order these days. In those days, we were having trouble persuading our policymakers that even though Chinese and Russians were communists, that they were at loggerheads, that they were fighting each other within the international communist movement and in real life along their border. Now, people couldn't believe that, and so they dismissed this. And finally, my friends who were photo interpreters called me from Rochester, where they were developing the latest films from these rather new satellites at the time. And they said, "Ray, you're going to be really happy. We have the evidence now." And suffice it to say, there were 15 Soviet heavily armed divisions on the Chinese border. And so we showed this to the president and his advisors, and the reaction we got, well, yeah, that really show anything, you know? And then what happened? Well, let me give you a little vignette of how difficult it is to get beyond the stock answers to these things. They're all commies, and they're all together, and they'll never get apart. One of our overhead missions detected a MiG-19 on the apron of the Shenyang airframe factory in China. MiG-19. We're talking 1967, 68. MiG-19, state of the art. So the troglodytes came to us and said, McGovern, so, you know, if they're at loggerheads, if the Chinese and Russians hate each other, how come the Russians are giving them straight state-of-the-art MiG-19s? Then I said, well, isn't that a airframe factory? Maybe the Chinese are making them themselves. Come on, the Chinese can't do that. And besides, the real clue, the real evidence is there's snow on the roof. And I said, Snow, yeah, of course. If you're going to produce these things, you have to have heat in these factories. And when you have heat in these factories, there's no snow on the roof. So you're wrong. They don't hate each other. They're still clommies in there together. Well, it took 3 years, and we had a defector, a Chinese defector, come in, and he was from Shenyang. And luckily, we said, "Do you know about the Shenyang airframe factory?" He said, yes, I used to work there. And we said, well, why are you going like this? He says, I'm still shivering. We had to wear 8 overcoats there because there was no heat, because they didn't, and it's why there was no snow on the roof, of course. The Chinese were doing it themselves. There were lots of other things that we ran into in terms of obstacles to making people believe. The last thing I'll mention is that we got word that the Chinese were blocking the shipment of Soviet arms to Hanoi, to North Vietnam. Gross violation of international communist solidarity. Nobody could believe it until we got the evidence. That's indeed what they were doing. Suffice it to say, those were the days when we believed, erroneously it turned out, that they would hate each other forever and ever. Amen. No, didn't turn out that way. We left ourselves in out. Before Kissinger and Nixon went to Moscow or Beijing, we told them that when a younger leadership comes in, they'll probably see the good sense in not debilitating each other to the extent they are, but we don't see that coming yet. Well, it did come with Zhou Enlai and others. Suffice it to say that Kissinger and Nixon were the kinds of policymakers that listened. And when they saw that the Chinese were far more afraid of the Russians than we were, when they saw not 15 divisions, but 40, count them, 40 divisions on the Chinese border, Mao and Zhou Enlai got scared. That opened wonderful opportunities for us because Kissinger and Nixon were smart enough to be able to exploit that fear. Nixon, as you know, went to Beijing in February of 1972, and the Russians started to make all kinds of concessions. Can you believe it? Berlin, that sticky wicket that could never have been resolved. That was resolved. There was a 4-partite agreement, and Berlin was solved. That was before Nixon went to Moscow to sign the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Now, I was involved in that negotiation. I headed up a branch called the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch, and I had 3 of my people seconded to one went with the delegation, Helsinki, Vienna, wherever it was. One reported from the military part of the agency, and the other rounded up things for the director and the president. I got to go to Moscow for the signing in May of 1972 of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which, as many of you know, was the cornerstone of strategic stability for 30 years, count them, 30, until George W. Bush, in his wisdom, got out of the treaty in 2002. So 1972 was the result of our ability to profit from the felt need on the part of the Chinese on one hand, part of the Russians on the other, to compete with each other so that neither stole a march in terms of developing good relations with the United States. Okay. In those days, the triangular relationship was, I would say, equilateral, you know? If I remember my geography, it was sort of like this, okay? Now it's isosceles. Remember your geometry, okay? It's like this.
Mm-hmm.
And who's on the short end? The United States. And whose fault is it? It's the fault of the policymakers who have done, well, let me put it this way, have done very unusual, some people say, crazy things. Now, let's just fast forward a little bit. When Vladimir Putin made a major speech at Valdai, 27th of October, he said lots of things, but among the things he said was, you know, I can't understand why the United States would take on China, would go after China at the same time they're battling us in Ukraine. I used to think, says Putin, I used to think there must be some clever, some subtle, some strategic reasoning behind this, but I no longer think so. I'm convinced that these people are just crazy. Sumashedshi. Russian word is walking out of your mind. Crazy, Putin's word. I have to tell you that it is crazy, okay? Now, who's in charge in Washington? I have to tell you that there are really some manifestations of who's in charge, and they go back many years, but let's start around 2015, when Mr. Putin told Obama, look, we don't like the idea of Al-Qaeda taking over Syria. Doesn't seem like a good idea to us. And what's going to happen if Bashar al-Assad is removed? So I just telling you, Mr. President, says Putin, that we're going to enter the fray there, and we're going to prevent Bashar al-Assad from being removed. Now, you're free to react in any way you like. To his credit, Obama said, John Kerry, his Secretary of State, you're in charge of negotiating with Sergei Lavrov. See if you can figure out some way to get a ceasefire with these crazy people who are going at it in Syria. They worked for 11 months. 11 months. Finally, they came to a ceasefire agreement approved personally by Putin and by Obama. What happened? 9 days after the ceasefire, the United States Air Force hit and bombed fixed Syrian army positions that had been there for several months. The ceasefire dissolved. It was scuttled by the U.S. Air Force. Now, before I talk about Kerry's reaction to that, I want to talk to you about Kerry as the epitome, as the representative of these Ivy League superior, exceptional. Let's say that's the word they use. They're exceptional people. And before I forget to mention it, read what Kerry said in Geneva yesterday at Davos. Because I won't repeat it, but it's typical of Kerry. Now, what did he say when the ceasefire fell apart? 2 days later, he's in Washington. This is so interesting. I'd ask you to pay real attention to this because it speaks volumes. Syria, says Kerry, is as complicated as I've ever seen, anything I've ever seen in public life, in the sense that there's probably about 6 wars going on at the same time. Kurd against Kurd, Kurd against Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Sunni, Shia, everybody against ISIL, people against Assad, Nusra. This is a mixed up sectarian civil war with strategic proxies. So it's very, very difficult, mind you, it's very, very difficult to be able to align all these forces. What the hell gave you, Secretary Kerry, the notion that you could align all these forces? Did you think that you were exceptional enough to be able to do that? Well, you were deceived. U.S. is not exceptional enough to do those things anymore. The other lesson, or the other teaching point to be drawn from this is 3 months later, Kerry explained exactly what happened. What happened to this ceasefire that Putin complained had been personally approved by not only him, but President Obama. Kerry said, well, unfortunate, this is in a newspaper interview. Unfortunately, we had divisions within our ranks that made implementation of that extremely hard to accomplish. But I believe it can work. It's late now, obviously, but what happened to Aleppo, he said, now it's really hard. Now we had people in our government, says Kerry, who were bitterly opposed to this ceasefire. I regret that. I think that was unfortunate. It was a mistake. I think you'd have a different situation there conceivably now if we, who did the ceasefire agreement, including our president, had been able to do that. So lots of lessons here. Kerry probably thought that he had concluded a ceasefire. So did Putin. So did Obama. But the US Air Force didn't think so. And so Kerry is unusually open in admitting that we had divisions in our own ranks. And he talked about the flights over Syria at the time. Why do I make a big point about this? Well, it's really noxious. Not only that the people of the same stripe as Kerry, I'm referring to the Ivy League types who came in with Biden, Tony Blinken, Sullivan, the whole lot of them. They remind me very much of the best and the brightest who got us involved in Vietnam way back then. They truly think they're exceptional. Now, what did Mr. Putin think about all this? Well, if you go back to 2013, there was a false flag attack outside of Damascus blamed on Bashar al-Assad. The Secretary Kerry got up a week later and said, it was Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad. He said it 25 times, okay? We know that it was a false flag attack. It was meant to introduce US involvement, overt involvement, not just the covert involvement in Syria. Now, what happened? Well, Kerry was on another mission. And so when Obama went up to St. Petersburg for a summit, he had a private discussion with Vladimir Putin. Putin said, now, Mr. Obama, do you remember when we were together at Lochern in Northern Ireland in June, and we set up that working group to get rid of Syrian chemical weapons? Yeah, I remember. Well, they've done their job. Syria has agreed to get rid of all its chemical weapons under UN supervision on a ship specially outfitted for such destruction. You have a couple of them. What do you think? And Obama said, wow, I didn't hear anything about this. Oh, so he said, well, if you want to listen to the Syrian foreign minister tomorrow, he's going to announce this. And sure enough, Syrian foreign minister said, we're going to have all our weapons, chemical weapons destroyed under UN supervision on a ship. Now, Obama said, this is a really good idea. In this way, I don't have to start another war. Obama later admitted that this was his finest hour. He went against what Obama called the Washington playbook, okay? This was amazing because A lot of people wanted a war on Syria. First and foremost, the neocons were very high, including Kerry. It was important to note that Kerry was shut out of this discussion. This is one-on-one between Obama and Putin. Where was Kerry? He was in Europe, in London. 3 days later, he was giving a big press conference advocating armed intervention, overt armed intervention in Syria. Last question from this press conference. Mr. Kerry, is there nothing the Syrians can do to prevent a war against them? Kerry, well, I suppose they could agree to destroy all their chemical weapons, but they're not going to do that. That's not in the cards. He gets on a plane to come home to Washington, and Obama calls him up and says, John, I forgot to tell you, we've got this deal. The Syrians are going to destroy all their nuclear weapons. Now, what's the point here? The point here is that Obama prevailed over the neocons. Now, the neocons can be described in various ways, but one way that I describe them are the people who have a vision wherein the strategic interests of Israel are the same as the strategic interests of the United States, okay? And precisely at this time, in early September 2013, the bureau chief of the New York Times thought there might be a war on Syria and she ought to talk to high-level Israeli officials. Now, the bureau chief for the New York Times in Jerusalem has access to these very high Israeli officials, and so she went. And one of them was the former chief of the mission in New York. And she said, now, tell me, what's Israel's preferred outcome in Syria? And they were told, she was told, well, this is a little bit embarrassing. Jody Ruderin was her name. It's a little embarrassing, doesn't sound good, but our preferred outcome is no outcome. Traduisez, s'il vous plaît? No outcome? Yeah, again, this isn't very nice, but as long as Shia and Sunni and the whole area is fighting each other, Israel has nothing to fear from Syria. A miracle happened. Jody Ruderin got her story as the lead item in the New York Times on the 7th of September, on the 7th of September, 2013. The censors must have been off having martinis in the Hamptons. So there it was. What's the preferred outcome? No outcome. So we see this welter of interests guiding U.S. policy. We see Blinken and Sullivan equally beholden to Israeli interests. That's really a big fly in the ointment because it affects virtually everything. So let me end now saying that I'm happy to discuss other things, but the bottom line for me is that the world order they have attempted to change the world order. They want to make it a rules-based international order. Now, I Googled that. I researched that. I couldn't find any definition for rules-based international order. It looks very much like the United States makes the rules with its lackey in the United Kingdom and others, and everyone else is supposed to base their actions on it. Well, that's not going to work anymore. Final thing I'll say is simply this. when Joe Biden, President Biden, got really scared about what was going to happen in Ukraine with the Russians moving many, many military units there, this is 2 years ago now, he called up Putin and said, look, what are you doing there? And Putin said, well, you know, look at the realities here. What are your clients doing to our Russian-speaking folks in Donbass, in Donetsk, and Lugansk? Well, it didn't look like such a favorable situation for a summit, but Biden said, hey, let's have a summit. I like person to person. So they went to Geneva, June 16th. Now, before they went, I wrote a little advisory as though I were in my old job writing the President's Daily Brief. And I said, please be advised that what the old Soviets used to call the world correlation of forces isn't what it used to be. It isn't the same Russia, China that used to exist. They are now joined at the hip. They see a common threat from you, Mr. President. And so be aware when you go into this talk with Mr. Putin that the backdrop of all this is a complete change in the world correlation of forces. Well, Biden didn't listen to me. And the most weird outcome of this came after the summit meeting when Joe Biden said, you know, it's not really proper for me to say what I told President Putin, but my God, he's got a real problem with China. They've got this long, many thousand-mile border. China is about to become a real potent military as well as economic power. Man, he's got a real problem. I think, yeah, he's being really very suspicious of China. Now, I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall when Putin turned to his advisors and said, huh? Suffice it to say, they spent the rest of the year, the Chinese and the Russians did, trying to show these sophomores advising Biden that no, it's not like it used to be. It's not like you read it in the history books at Yale and Harvard. We're joined at the hip and we're facing you, a common enemy. And this has played out in many ways. The last and most important way, of course, was when Mr. Putin decided that he couldn't really trust the United States after President Biden had said that Washington has, quote, no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, end quote. That disappeared. His advisors said, no, you can't say that, Joe. And so the negotiators in Geneva pretended they never heard about that undertaking, okay? That was just one thing. The Ukrainian army seemed about set to invade Donbass and do away or take care of the rest of the Russian-speaking people there. In any case, what I'm saying here with respect to China was that Putin went up to China for the beginning of the Olympics. It was February 4th, 2021. 22, sorry, yeah, last year. Get my years mixed up. So what happened there? Well, I'll close with this. In my view, and I'm interpreting it post facto, what happened, how the Chinese reacted. During that summit, I believe that Putin said, I can't trust the West. They're about to attack our Russian people in Donbass. There are pro-Nazis running that government. The Americans are reneging on promises, the only real promise they made back in New Year's Eve. I'm going to have to I think I'm going to have to invade Ukraine. What do you think, President Xi? Now, my notion of how Xi reacted was, you mean after the Olympics are over, right? Right. Olympics were over on the 22nd of February. Donetsk and Lugansk were recognized as independent countries on the 23rd of February. On the 24th of February, the Russians went into Ukraine. Now, do I think that was a good thing? No, it was an awful thing. People getting killed right and left. It was a terrible thing. Do I think it was unprovoked? No way was it unprovoked. The history of the last decade shows quite well how this was provoked. Last thing I'll say on this is that if you compare what happened in Cuba in 1962, when John F. Kennedy was provoked by offensive strike missiles of the same range in Cuba, well, nobody criticized him for doing illegal things like a blockade, like preparations for an invasion of Cuba, like threatening world war, nuclear war. Nobody criticized him. Why? Because it was an existential threat to the United States, and Khrushchev, to his credit, recognized it as such and said, well, it's not an existential threat to us. Let's get out of Dodge. Let's get these things out of here, okay? The Turkey codicil to this agreement is also important. You'll recall that the U.S. agreed to take these kinds of missiles out of Turkey at the same time. What's the comparison here? Well, these offensive strike missiles, there are holes already prepared for them in Romania, in Poland. Biden said we won't put them in Ukraine, but then they forgot about it, okay? What I'm saying here is that Putin, in my view, views these missiles with warning time of 5 to 7 minutes as the same kind of existential threat that John Kennedy faced in 1962. Now, when a nuclear power feels an existential threat, it's going to use what it has to remove that existential threat. So what's the chances of this ending peacefully? I think the side, in this case, the United States, Ukraine is not an existential threat. Cuba was not an existential threat to Khrushchev. So this has to stop, because if it doesn't stop, the Russians are going to just kind of move in, and Biden will be left with the decision as to whether to succumb to the neocons and others who might suggest escalation up to, God forbid, nuclear tactical weapons. Maybe we'll leave it there on that happy note, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray, for raising many interesting and complicated points, and I would like to unpack some of them. Actually, I would like to start with Syria, with a little story. Back in February 2014, I got a permission to actually leave house arrest and attend an event to celebrate the inauguration of the Constitution of Tunisia at the Hyatt in Washington, D.C. And next to me was the guy in charge of the Syria and Libya desk in the State Department's planning division. And I asked him, what is the U.S., he thought I was a journalist, what's the U.S. Position and policy vis-a-vis Syria? And it was very interesting that he was pretty frank and pretty open about it. He said, our policy is that there is no winner and that the fight should continue until they bleed each other. I said, what are you talking about? And he starts, talking about the regime and the opposition. And that was pretty clear. And he was pretty open about this. And then, of course, later on, we see that the U.S. policy in northern Syria, the fight, the so-called fight against ISIS, was actually an attempt by the U.S. to arm and strengthen the Kurdish militia so that they threaten Turkey, and therefore Turkey has to come back. This is what balance of power is all about. This is one of the strategic objectives of the US. Whenever it sees a major country trying to go beyond its borders and empower itself in the region, become a region power or a regional hegemon, what they do is to create another force so that they can threaten that hegemon or that rising power. So the policy in northern Syria is pretty similar to that. What that tells me that the US really doesn't care about the Syrian people. You talked about that, but I think part of what's missing in your speech is the agency of the Syrian people. Certainly the Syrian people at the beginning of their uprising, they wanted some freedoms, but that was quickly taken over by this international rivalry taking place, and certainly by some regional powers who are trying to exploit the situation. And the victim, as we see today, are the Syrian people. But I want to come back to the policy part of it, which is, no winner, and try to bleed everybody without any regard to the suffering of the people, whether it has to do with Syria or whether it has to do with Iraq or whether it has to do with other struggling people. When you look at the objectives of U.S. hegemony, and I mean, I'm sure you're one of the followers of John Mearsheimer's theory, about being in the unipolar moment, about adopting liberal hegemony, and that's how it's being transformed now. And you talked a lot about China and Russia. You talked that there is a realignment that's not the same as in the past, your days when you were analyzing both as being perhaps strategic enemies, but today we find them to become strategic partners. So my first part of the question that I'd like to address is this U.S. policy of not really caring much about the people, even though they use these liberal concepts of try to establish rule of law and democracy and human rights and all that, while on the ground it's really the opposite. They want to bleed these people. And secondly, about this international world order that is emerging now, with, as you say it, or as you articulated, that there is really a Russian-Chinese axis versus a Western axis or American axis, where America at the same time it's fighting Russia, it's also fighting China, which doesn't make any sense, because that means it's solidifying this kind of a combined power of Russia and China. What do you say about that?
Well, I agree with your premises here. And when you said it's sort of a crazy thing to do, well, it is. And I have to say that on this point, I agree with Mr. Putin. It's just plain crazy to take on the other two superpowers. Now, what lies behind this? My God, it's the people. It's the same people that thought they could beat all those Vietnamese that the French and the others before them never could subdue. It's the same sort of elitism, exceptionalism, indispensability that these people who are educated to believe this still apparently believe. John Kerry, I mentioned as an exemplar of this. When I talk at universities, sometimes we talk about this exceptionalism or the U.S. being indispensable. And I say, who knows what synonyms are? And usually a couple of people go, those are like words, right? I said, yes, well, what's an antonym? And usually there's just one or two who say, oh, that's an opposite word. That's right. Okay. So what's the opposite word? What's the antonym for indispensable?
Dispensable.
And they all kind of look at me, say, oh yeah, well, dispensable?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So if we're indispensable, by definition, the rest of the world is dispensable. Well, how do you think people in the rest of the world look at that? People talk now about the unipolar world gone. That is true. They talk about the multipolar world emerging. That's also true, but I prefer to look at it as a bipolar world in both senses of the word, if you will. Okay. Now, why do I say bipolar? Because if you look at it, and if you look at the elitist, racist underpinnings of U.S. policy, you see a really noxious brew. You see a feeling that we are entitled to do everything. It's sort of like, like we just can do whatever we want and we'll create our own rules-based order to give it some veneer of lawfulness. I mean, it's not going to work. And so what we end up with is the lily white West. Look at NATO. What's one common element? Lily white West against people of color. That's an awfully noxious thing. China, India, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Iran. I mean, we may have a lot of power, that is, we in the West, but we're talking about 80% of the population. And we're still acting in the mold of George Kennan. George Kennan knew a lot about Russia, but he was also an elitist.
Do you want to explain to our audience who George Kennan was?
George Kennan was our ambassador to the Soviet Union during the war and after the war, and he crafted the containment policy.
The architect.
Russians at bay, okay?
Yeah, the architect of the Russian policy for 50 years.
Right, yeah, and he was, after the war, in 1948, he was head of the newly founded State Department Policy Planning Group. And the first paper that he wrote said, we, America, dominate or have control over about 50% of the world's natural resources, but we only represent 1/9 the world's population. And so our policy has to be formulated in such a way as to maintain this disequilibrium. We cannot be misled by false things like human rights. It's going to come to the exercise of pure power. 1948, okay? Now, today, the United States has domain over, not 50% anymore, maybe what, 20% of the world's natural resources? And it doesn't comprise 1/9 of the world's population anymore, more like 1/5 or so. And these elitists that study George Kennan and think that's what the policy should be, can't get it out of their head that the world has changed. Witness what they told Biden before the summit with Putin, that China is really pressing Russia. We can still use this leverage. Well, I mean, nothing could be farther from the truth. But if these elite sophomores, I call them, think that they can do this, and they do, and they issue statements saying, well, China's the next enemy after we get rid of Russia. Now, hello, the Chinese and the Russians looking at this and saying, my God, Xi Jinping says, oh, so we're next after you deal with Russia. Mark my words, if it comes to open hostilities between NATO or the US and Russia in Europe, there will be trouble in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. There will be trouble in the Taiwan Strait. That is how closely united Russia and China are these days. It's a strategic alignment as well as economic. And let me give you a little vignette. the refusal of our policymakers and our captive media to recognize these new realities can be illustrated just this past week in a little vignette. China announced that last year, Sino-Russian trade soared by a third, 34% over the previous year, reaching $190 billion. The goal of $200 billion previously set for 2024 may be reached beforehand. Chinese announcement. Russia plays this. McGovern writes up a little tweet. Okay, what happens? The tweet goes, but then there's a warning. This tweet links to a Russia state-affiliated media website. Find out more. Now, what's my point? The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal has not reported this. We did a search just last night. Now, is this significant? A 34% increase in bilateral trade? And looking forward to 200 billion? Well, I'll tell you something. When I was the analyst for Sino-Soviet relations, annual trade turnover between Russia and China was 200 million with an M, okay? Now, my mathematics sons tell me, and you would know better, Sami, that I think that's 1,000 times bigger, right?
It is. You're right. Well, let me turn over now to Weiss. He will engage you.
It's not in our press. So what they're trying to do, it seems to me, is just to sort of remain in denial that this counterforce is more and more powerful. We elite, exceptional, indispensable people are going to prevail. It's idiocy. I have to say, I agree with Putin again. It's crazy.
Weiss.
Thank you so much, Mr. McGovern. I have two questions stemming from your comments. Number one is, I was surprised to hear from you that, this desire for untarnished information for which the CIA was created and which was the reason for its existence, was unable to get basic facts right. And this storyline
was unable
to get basic facts of the world order correct. Given the fact that capabilities, meaning information gathering capabilities, by the NSA and others has increased manifold since the time you were an analyst, have we overcome the inability to get the facts right with the new capabilities or not? How does the technology help us or does not help us in getting the facts right? Number one, that's my first question. So
let me answer that first before I forget. When I was chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch and in Moscow for the signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, Kissinger and Nixon had asked us beforehand, do you think that the Russians are serious about limiting strategic arms? We said, yes. Kissinger said, why? We said two things. They don't want to spend themselves into oblivion, and they're deathly afraid that the thing will get out of hand and that China will develop better relations with the United States than Russia has. Those were two key elements, okay? Now, what Kissinger said then, okay, if the Russians cheat, you think they'll cheat? Don't know. Well, if they cheat, can you tell us? And how soon could you tell us? We're talking about big radars, okay? And we went back to our satellite people and we said, how soon? I said, well, we'll know in 10 days. And so we went back to Kissinger and said, we'll know in 10 days. Are you sure? as sure as we can be. Well, what happened? Kissinger decided to trust but verify. Doverai no proverai in Russian. Okay, it wasn't Reagan later. It was Nixon and Kissinger that decided they would take that chance. Okay, did the Russians cheat? Yes, they cheated. Did they build yet another radar? Yes. Did we find it? We did. It was in Krasnoyarsk, way out in the middle of Siberia. Reagan called them on it. Go show the Russians those photos, he told us. And we did. It took 6 years. But finally, when Gorbachev came in, he said, okay, it's illegal. It's an ABM radar. Tear it down. What's the point here? The point is that if we have verification, that we have a lot of things going for us. Now trust is evaporated. Let's take MH17. For your audience, let's remind people that on the 17th of July, 2014, so just a few months after the coup that the West arranged in Kiev, a Malaysian airliner was shot down with about 300 people killed, okay? Now, John Kerry, my favorite John Kerry, got up and said, aha, we know who did it. We have imagery, we have trajectory information, we know where it was shot from, we know when it hit the plane, we know when the plane came down. It was the Russians, or it was the pro-Russians in Ukraine. Okay, John Kerry, where's that evidence? Oh, it never came. 3 people have now been convicted in a Dutch court for participating in this. Were they shown this evidence? No, the Dutch court said, we don't need that evidence. Now, is there evidence about who shot down MH17? I, from my knowledge of our collection capabilities, even though it's a little dated, am convinced that there is evidence, that we know pretty much exactly, we know almost exactly who shot that plane down. Was it what John Kerry says? I have to say no. Why? Because otherwise he would give us that information that he bragged about in all these press interviews. So what does this mean? This means that you really can't trust the real evidence to come into play. And getting back to your question here, our technical capabilities for collection and for not so much for assessing, but for collecting from satellites, signals, intelligence is unparalleled. It's never been better. What happens to it when it gets to Washington? Unfortunately, I have to tell you that unlike President Truman, President Biden is almost certainly not getting untreated intelligence. Otherwise, he would never say that the Ukrainian army is winning, that just with a little bit more weapons deliveries, Ukraine can prevail. It's crazy. Ukraine can't prevail, and we're going to find that out in the next couple of months. And unless the U.S. comes to its senses and says, well, okay, how far does Putin want to go with those tanks? Unless that happens, I fear for what the reaction will be, because the American public is totally unprepared for the notion of a Russian win. And if you look at the map, and if you have a modicum of analytic capability on military affairs, you see that, as Obama himself said, Russia has escalatory dominance in that area. And there's not anything that NATO or the United States can do now to prevent the Russian advance. This is serious. This is very serious. And Biden, advised by the sophomores, I wish I had more confidence in what his reaction will be. More important, put yourself in Biden's shoes. I mean, he has to prepare for the worst. His military analysts have to look at capabilities, not intentions. And so, again, the situation is worse than during Cuba. There is no communication between the two, not that we can speak of. And the gauntlet has been thrown down. The next couple of months will be key to see who prevails in Ukraine, and the ramifications are likely to be worldwide and to the detriment of the West.
My second question, thank you so much. My second question is, you raised this question of who is in charge, and I wanted to ask.
What? I'm sorry.
You raised the question of who is in charge, right? You said who is in charge in Washington, and I wanted to dive deeper into that. So one way of looking at who's in charge is to think that there are elite business interests. First of all, I want to note that when you said who's in charge, you never signaled to the people. Like, you never said that the American people are in charge. You always said that there are some Ivy League white lily elites that are in charge. And by these, I wanted to understand, so usually we think that American politicians and policymakers are beholden by corporate interests. But then you said that even when the American president and his staff make a decision, the American military has the capacity to override that through action on the ground, like what happened in Syria. So my question is, who is actually in charge? There is the military establishment, and then there is these politicians and policymakers, and then there are these elite corporate interests. How can you give us a 101 on how policy and foreign policy is made, very briefly, in Washington with all of these competing interests?
Your question couldn't be more relevant. And again, I would just simply suggest we put ourselves into Putin's shoes or Xi Jinping's shoes and ask ourselves the same question. Who is in charge in Washington, particularly now that Biden is undergoing even more political turmoil personally and his family? I mean, this is a very unhealthy, a very delicate, very dangerous situation, because people tend to do strange things internationally when they're under great pressure domestically. So who's in charge? Well, the best way to answer this is not the American people. Democracy, well, General Eisenhower warned, as many of you know, right before he left office, that what he called the military-industrial complex has grown like Topsy, has grown greatly since the end of the war, and that the accumulation of power, intended or not intended, he said, is a danger to U.S. freedom. Now, what did he mean? He said, look, this machinery that has been built up since the war and the reaction to the Russian threat endangers our freedom and our democracy unless, and what was that unless? Unless there is a well-educated citizenry. That's the fly in the ointment. We don't have a well-educated American citizenry. I want to borrow something from a comedian, Will Rogers, from the last century. He famously said, "It ain't what the people don't know. It's what the people know that ain't so. That's the problem." People know there's a great Russian threat. People know there's the yellow peril emerging from China. People know that because of the media. And so I have coined a new acronym for military-industrial complex. It's the Mickey Mat. Got a pencil? Okay. Mickey Mat. It rhymes sort of like with Mickey Mouse. Easy to remember. Here it is. Military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Mickey Mat. Why do I say media as if in all capital letters, because media is the linchpin. Without the media, the rest of the Mickey Mouse doesn't work. And so this is the problem in our country. The media has misinformed the American people to the point where after 6 years of being brainwashed, and I use that term advisedly, brainwashed on how Russia is responsible for Donald Trump, Russia meddled in our elections in 2016, maybe 2020, the American people have been trained to hate the Russians. And you've got to be taught. Maybe none of you know about the South Pacific musical that was prevalent when I was growing up, but the lyrics went this way. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to hate all the people your colleagues fear. You've got to be carefully taught. You have to be taught. The Americans have been taught for 6 full years now. My concern is that if Biden, Sullivan, and what's his name, Blinken, if they say Russians need to be attacked and we're going to attack them in Europe, most Americans will think, well, these Russians are real evil. Putin is devil incarnate, worse than Hitler. They'll go along with it. So that's the danger. And that's where the power lies, in the Mickey Mouse. Again, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex.
Thank you, Ray. I've been reading, almost done with it, this book by Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick, The Untold History of the United States. He goes all the way from Wilson to Obama. There are so many stories that tells us so much about how American decision-making takes place, particularly among the Mickey Mouse that you mentioned. But at the end of the day, even those who finance the media or own the media, those who finance academia, those who finance the think tanks, there's a higher power, it seems to me, that those people who would like to build and maintain an empire. And even politicians, and you've been a good study on that, how they finance campaigns. You're going to find some mavericks here and there. And it's interesting, one of the stories that he mentions was that the vice president of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was Henry Wallace, who was pretty much a peace advocate, and how the people within the Democratic Party conspired against him to get him out and get Truman in, where Truman really was the know-nothing person. And of course, a few months later, Roosevelt died. But the question here is that there are people who think of themselves as the American exceptionalism, who think of themselves entrusted with maintaining and preserving the American empire, and much of the American people probably are unaware. I'm not talking about conspiracy theory here. I'm talking about real facts that you can point to, people with real influence and power, and then you have the inertia. After you build these infrastructures, then you have an inertia. You saw it in intelligence, you see it in the different levels of power around Washington, particularly the Pentagon, the defense industry, and so on and so forth, and it becomes extremely difficult to go against them. You have some of these defense companies, they would have plants and factories in all 50 states. So every congressional member, whether in the Senate or Congress or the House, they would be fighting for them, because that means real jobs within their districts or states. In other words, you have a system that is very, very difficult to reverse. And that system, once they maintain the mighty dollar, the hegemony of the dollar, where the dollar is the supreme currency in the world, where you can print it without any real consequence, and therefore you're going to have the oil around the globe, particularly in the Gulf producing countries, dictating to them that they have to sell oil using dollars, otherwise the United States cannot maintain its economic power around the world. So you have this whole world structure. Now come along these states that are trying to append, they're trying to change the world order. And of course, the United States is going to fight like hell to not let them do it. And what we're seeing today in the Ukraine is one story, where you're trying to basically defeat the Russians. Your position, you're maintaining that this is never going to happen, not just because the Russians have nuclear weapons, it's just because of the balance of power that between Russia and Ukraine. So as you see all this, as you notice all this, do you, and from the inside, do you see American empire going up, going down, maintaining its status? Where do you see it? And add to that mix also this polarization that is taking place or has been taking place at least since the Bush years, but more acutely since the Trump phenomena and the Wall Street and all that, the Wall Street Occupy movement and all that. So where do you see the future of American empire from where you're looking in Virginia?
Very good question, Sami. The answer is simply that I see it staying steady for the next week or so. It's headed down. I mean, the handwriting is on the wall, and not least, you mentioned the dollar. The dollar is not going to be what the dollar has to be for the U.S. to survive in the way it has become used to surviving. So, in a word, you've got this bipolar world, in my view, multipolar, if you wish, but the U.S. is in the minority now. The world of George Kennan back in 1948 is long since gone. The only problem is that these fancy fellows from Harvard and Yale still think pretty much what Rudyard Kipling did think before he helped his son get into the army and get himself killed. Thinking Rudyard Kipling, here's a little very, very indicative, very suggestive poem from Rudyard Kipling. It has to do with, well, let me just say it. It is not wise for the Christian white to hustle the Asian brown, for the Christian smiles and the Asian riles, and he weareth the Christian down. At the end of the fight lies a tombstone white with the name of the late deceased, and the epitaph drear, a fool lies here who tried to hustle the East. Those are prophetic words. I mean, it's taken a couple of centuries now, but the U.S. has overreached itself. Its satraps or its vassals in Europe, the UK first and foremost. I know Germany pretty well. I cannot believe how the German people can tolerate the kind of government that will kowtow as it does to the United States, to the point of allowing Nord Stream 2 to be blown up and blamed on the Russians of all people. I mean, what's going on there? So I see
what's going on in Germany. That's a good question. Do you know the answer to that?
Well, again, you have a bunch of political hacks running that government. You have a very divided populace, but you have a devotion, an almost sycophantic devotion by German leaders to whatever Tony Blinken, of all people, say. Now, how long that lasts is a matter for discussion, but that's the way it is now. It continues to frustrate me and to baffle me 78 years after the end of World War II.
And do you think that Europe is going to always kowtow the United States, just follow blindly? Don't you think that at one point they're going to find out that their economies are hurting so much, their people are hurting so much, that the cost is just way beyond their capacity to continue on this path.
Again, Sami, I think we're solid to continue on this path for about one more week. It's going to fall apart.
What would replace it? Let's say you're right. Let's say you're right. The American empire is on the decline, and that eventually, I don't know whether they will draw from the world, but obviously their power will wane. What would replace it?
I'm sorry?
What would be the replacement of American power, globally speaking?
Well, there seems to be an entente already developing between Russia, China, India. We have the BRICS. We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These people are gradually displacing power and real armed strength from the United States. Now, the problem, if I were Xi Jinping or Putin, I would say, look, we do this gradually. Maybe these elitist, indispensable people will wake up. We don't want to provoke them, but it's inevitable. So let's play our cards carefully, slowly, but very, very much determinedly, so that the rest of the world will see that there is a new world order here, and it has nothing to do with whatever people call the new rules-based international order. That's a fiction. It's not even in Google, for God's sake.
Wow. All right, I'm going to give the microphone next to Weiss. Maybe he can ask you about Israel-Palestine. We'll see what he would ask.
I wanted to.
We can't hear you, Weiss.
Can you hear me now?
You're muted. Either you're muted, or I tried to send you something, said you're not here. I don't know what's going on.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, maybe I'm.
Okay, we can't hear you still.
I'm in the
Now we
wrong
can.
channel.
Okay,
Yeah,
now
I
we
was
can.
in the.
I was in the wrong channel. Sorry.
No problem.
I wanted to ask about the Muslim world. I mean, this region. I mean, you guys based in Istanbul, so I wanted to begin with asking you about Turkey, especially in terms of your comments on Syria. So, from Ankara's position, defeating Assad was a way of extending Turkish influence beyond its borders into the Arab world, because Assad was seen as being aligned with Iran. And it seems as though
Weiss, we can't hear you. You're frozen. Your picture is frozen, Weiss. Okay. All right. Ray, I don't know what happened with the voice connection. It's frozen, but I think his question had to do with Turkey and Iran and the greater Middle East and US policy within that region. How do you see it from your perspective, knowing, of course, that this whole thing came after the uprisings through many capitals, through many countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, others, where the people were trying to get, obviously, I wouldn't say that these were CIA orchestrated uprisings, that these were genuine uprisings. Of course, they went into different directions, and certainly there was regional and international manipulations. But knowing all this, and of course, from your perspective as an American, someone who sees American foreign policy and is deeply troubled by how it's going, how do you see the region as these new formations taking place in the globally speaking?
Well, in the simplest of terms, U.S. policy toward the Middle East is really a function of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Israel has inordinate influence on U.S. policy there, and Israel is scared. It has reason to be scared because the U.S. is being gradually displaced in influence in the Middle East. Even the Saudis, for God's sake, are not kowtowing anymore to the U.S. Even the Chinese are coming in and dealing with the Saudis. It must be very rattling to Netanyahu. And my concern is what he might do to foment some kind of uprising that will require, in quotes, the US neocons to intervene there as well. So in broad terms, the US influence is receding big time in the Middle East. It's being displaced by things like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and more attractive alternatives. And before you know it, the dollar, not before you know it, it will take a couple more years, but the dollar is not going to survive all this. And that will be a woeful experience for Americans. And they don't quite appreciate that yet because they don't get any media treating these very important issues.
Well, back to always.
Was that?
I think we've had
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sorry, I had a technical problem there. I wanted to ask about Turkey, as they say, the new, formerly known as Turkey. Turkey saw the opportunity to overthrow Bashar al-Assad as a way of trying to extend its influence beyond what has been called the Shiite Crescent, the area of influence that Iran had created between Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The West, on the Syrian civil war, left Turkey on its own. It left it in, it turned its back on the plan to overthrow Assad. And Turkey then found on its borders the PKK being armed by the Americans. I wanted to ask you, how does the United States see Turkey now in after Turkey's gradual rise in both in military and also in economic power?
I think the sophomores running our policy look at Turkey as a kind of an interesting sidelight here. The most important factor has to be whether the Turks will stand up against Swedish and Finnish accession to NATO. They probably will have to be bought off again, F-16s, something like that. But the US is not really interested in solving the main issues. What happens on the northern border of Syria will be very interesting. Why is the US still around there? Why is the US still in Iraq? Well, I would imagine that in 2023, we might see the US having no choice but to leave both of those areas. I think the Turkish government probably believes that to be the case, and they'll deal with this when that time comes. The Kurds, well, the Kurds are the orphans of history, as you know. They have been tossed about, around and about, and all I can say is that they were never given their homeland, and therein lies a terrible human problem, which is not going to be solved by this kind of great power rivalry.
Okay. Are you done, Awais?
Yeah, I wanted to give it back to you. I have more questions here.
Go ahead. You can ask one more if you like.
I would like to ask about continuing with the issue about Iran. So one of the things that happened over the course of the last 20 years is the back and forth on Iran. You know, especially with the nuclear deal, and then the Trump years, and then again trying to revive the nuclear deal. Can you tell us what's happening behind the curtain? I mean, what is going on with Iran, the US's relationship with Iran? If you say that Israel is the most important actor here, then it seems as though on the question of Iran, either Israel doesn't know what it wants, or the United States doesn't know what it wants. Can you please, from your experience, tell us what is happening in that context?
Well, in my view, Israel knows precisely what it wants. and it pretty much tells the U.S. what to do. Biden has shown himself not even as strong as Obama in facing into the problem of an Iranian nuclear weapon. Obama, that was his main success, for God's sake, in foreign policy, that agreement. Now it's fallen by the wayside. Biden haphazardly started to renew it and was told, no, don't do that. So I think this is evidence par excellence of Israel's hold on U.S. policy, and it's regrettable. The Iranians, until now, I hope most people know, have not been working on a nuclear weapon. There was a national intelligence estimate written in November 2007, and this is the most authoritative genre of U.S. intelligence, which said that Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon, and that was said with high confidence. Now, this prevented Bush and Cheney from starting a war against Iran or letting the Israelis do so. Bush says so. This is W. Bush, says so in his memoirs. Check them out, okay? But U.S. policy has been really, really wishy-washy on this, despite the fact that U.S. intelligence says that still, as regards forming a nuclear warhead, a nuclear weapon, the Iranians have not been doing that. Matter of fact, there are fatwas. There are lots of things that would militate against Iran doing that. Now, where does that leave us? It leaves us in a very sorrowful position, because just as in Syria, no outcome, just as so too with this agreement that was so painfully worked out by the Obama government, no outcome there either in terms of renewing it. So this doesn't bode well for what's in store for the Middle East. But the Iranians have been, in my view, very circumspect in not developing the nuclear warhead. Now, who knows what they will do? There is still a fatwa against it, and you know more about fatwas and how seriously to take them than I do.
Ray, the last question, we have 3 minutes left in the program today. The last question, again, the topic was about the future of U.S. empire and the world order. This last question has to do with the internal situation within the United States. As you see developments going between the polarization taking place, the Trumpism and the elections in a couple of years, how do you see the dynamics taking place within the country today vis-a-vis the American empire? Do you see, does it hasten and speed up the process of the disintegration or the weakening of the American empire? Do you see rejuvenation? You were talking about the elites. Do you see these elites, because you always had these elites from both parties, working together to maintain the American empire? Do you see this as the start of the collapse of the? How do you see it from your advantage point?
I see it as chaotic domestically. I see that as a very dangerous situation, with the situation that is about to evolve in Ukraine. There will be lots of backbiting. There will be lots of suggestions that the U.S. enter the fray in an open military way. This will be entertained because people have been brainwashed to believe that the Russians have done this in an unprovoked way, and they need to be driven back and given a bloody nose. My God, the Russians have the preponderance of strength there, what Obama called escalatory dominance. And as Obama once said, U.S. interests in Ukraine pale in significance to Russian interests. So unless some level-headed people come in, lots of luck, There's going to be this disarray. There's going to be this chaotic state. And once again, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of Putin and Xi Jinping and figure out we have to be prepared for the worst. We have to get together and we have to gather as many other countries together, these countries being outside the realm of what I call the lily white West.
Thank you so much, Raymond, for being with us the past hour and a half and giving us your wisdom and expertise of so many years and decades. I want to thank everybody, particularly my colleague Awais Khan, for being part of this discussion. And also I want to give special thanks to our translators, Omar Qahfaji and Dana Kassab. From the comments I get, they're doing, as always, great job. I want to thank the audience also for being with us and for all the questions that have been forwarded. And I'm looking forward to see everybody